Kia ora koutou and welcome to Science Live at Te Papa. My name's Ruth and I'm here to take you on a journey behind the scenes of the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa. Now, for those of you who've watched Science Live before, you might realise we're actually in a different location today. Normally we're upstairs in the education classroom and today we're in the botany laboratory, which should give you a little bit of a clue as to what we'll be talking about. Most of the science that happens here at Te Papa takes place behind the scenes. Our scientists are always analysing, collecting and writing up data. So Science Live is your opportunity to get into their world and find out more about what it's like to be a scientist at Te Papa and also the kind of things they research. So if you have any questions for our scientist who's featuring on today's Science Live or for any of our scientists here at Te Papa, you can ask them via Twitter using the hashtag ScienceLiveTePapa, on our blog, or by emailing sciencelive@tepapa.govt.nz. Now, today, for his very first Science Live, I'd like to welcome Curator of Botany, Leon Perrie. So come on in, Leon. And it's lovely to have you here on your first Science Live.
Thanks, Ruth. It's good to be here.
So you're a curator of botany, which I'm guessing means you study plants. But can you tell us a little bit more about what that involves?
Sure. I work with Te Papa's collection of dried pressed plant specimens. We've got nearly 280,000 of them. So we work to add to the collection, get in more specimens, and to study the collection. And we're using it to learn more about New Zealand's plants.
Okay.
And my specialty is ferns.
Okay, so ferns, we're probably all familiar with them, particularly as the silver fern's an emblem for lots of New Zealand sports teams. But what is a fern exactly, and how is it different from other plants?
Well, let's look at a few maybe typical examples of ferns. I'll see if I can find one in this display book. So here's a specimen of a fern that people might be familiar with. Kind of a triangular shaped leaf, and it's fairly dissected or divided, so we call those fronds. But not all ferns look like this. Some of them are a bit stranger looking. So, for instance, this is a fern too. So if you want to get your eye in for what is a fern, we've actually got a quiz on our blog site. What is a fern? Or is this a fern? So have a go and get your eye in for distinguishing ferns. Now, ferns are generally medium-sized plants, but some are pretty small, maybe only a few centimetres long. Others are very tall, like some of the big tree ferns, which can get up to about 20 metres. Some are the size of some of the ground ferns that occur overseas are actually bigger than a car. We don't have anything quite that big in New Zealand. But what really sets ferns apart is, well, they differ from some of the smaller plants like mosses and liverworts, in that ferns have specialised tubes in them, vascular tissue we call it, for conducting water and soluble foods. So mosses and liverworts don't have those. Now seed plants do have that vascular tissue. And how ferns differ from seed plants is that seed plants make seeds and ferns don't have seeds. Instead, the critical part of the fern life cycle is their spores. This is what they use to kind of disperse or to get around to colonise new environments.
Okay, so ferns have spores instead of seeds. Now, I'd probably associate spores more with fungi. So what's the role of a spore in a fern?
Sure, well, we'll get to that, but let's have a look at where the spores are made first, because that's quite useful. So I want to switch to a photo here.
Okay.
And what we're looking at here is the underside of a fern frond, and the spores have been made in capsules that in this particular fern, the spore capsules are kind of aggregated or clustered into lines on the margins or edge of the frond.
So is that in this photo, that the orange bit on the side of the fern?
Yeah, that's right. So that's the whole lot of the spore capsules joined together. Now, why this is quite useful is that different ferns have different shapes and positions of their spore capsules. So I'll show you a second example. So in this one here, again, the spore capsules are in lines. Again, we can see those orange lines, but they're away from the margin. In other ferns, the spore capsules are in little cups on the sides of the fronds.
Okay, so in that one, to me, as a non-botanist, that does look like a cluster of tiny blackberries, not a cluster of spores.
Well, those are the spore capsules, and we'll look at them a bit more closely, or some other examples shortly. In this one here, again, quite different. We've got the spore capsules aggregated into circular clusters away from the margin. Something similar happening in this one. And what I want to do here is zoom up or highlight one particular spore capsule here. So in that middle of that blue circle is one spore capsule. And you can see there are a lot of spore capsules in that shot.
Okay, so that's one spore capsule on many spore capsules each fern has. But is there just one spore in each capsule, or is there more than one?
No, in this particular group of ferns, I happen to know that there will be 64 spores in each of those spore capsules. In other ferns, there may be hundreds of spores in a spore capsule. So there's a lot of spores being made in that the picture that we've seen. And if you think of a big tree fern and the size of its frond, it's actually going to be making millions of spores.
That's an incredible amount of spores then floating around New Zealand's countryside. So how big are these spores? Are they wee when they're a little fern and much bigger if they're a tree fern?
No, there's not really a correlation like that, although some spores are a little bit smaller and some are a bit bigger, but they're all pretty tiny. They're only a single cell. And to get an idea of how big a spore is, if you think of a size of a centimetre and then divide that by 10, and then divide that by 10 again, and then halve it, that's about the typical size of a fern spore.
So that's incredibly small then. So you've got these spore capsules that make spores, they're inside, they're ready to leave. What happens next?
Some ferns actually have a special mechanism which literally catapults the spores out of the capsule when the spores are ready. And we've got a video on our blog site which shows that quite nicely. In other ferns, the spore capsule more or less disintegrates when the spores are ready and the spores just fall out. In either case, most of the spores are going to land probably pretty close to the parent plant, except if it's windy. And if it's windy, remembering the spores are so tiny, they can get blown a long way.
And it's quite often windy in Wellington, so I imagine that happens quite frequently. So the spore has been catapulted or blown out of its spore capsule, and it's landed somewhere, then what happens?
Well, if the spore lands somewhere good, and for most ferns that's going to mean somewhere that it's shaded and damp, then it'll grow into something that we call a gametophyte.
And that's kind of baby fern, I'm guessing?
No, not really. Let me show you a picture of a gametophyte, of a fern. Now, all land plants actually have gametophytes, but the ferns are special because their gametophytes are actually free-living and independent. And we can see this one here on screen. It's about the size of a fingernail or smaller, and it's green, and it's capable of photosynthesis, and so it's using sunlight to make its own food.
Okay, so the gametophyte is separate to both the spore and the adult fern. What exactly is its role then?
The clue's in its name. So gametophyte, the phyte is plant, and gamete is the gametes or the sex cells. So the role of the gametophyte is to make the male and female reproductive cells, the fern equivalent of egg and sperm. And if they combine, that's where we start to get the baby ferns forming. So let's have another look at a photo of that. Here we've got this is on a soil bank, bare soil bank. It's a good place to spot fern gametophytes because they're not obscured or kind of hidden by bigger plants on those bare banks. So we've got a whole lot of those little green heart-shaped structures, the gametophytes, but in the top right-hand corner you might see that there are a few baby ferns beginning to emerge.
Okay, so that's quite a complex life cycle for something that we actually think of as quite simple. So let me check with you that I've got this right. Adult ferns make spores inside spore capsules. These spores are then catapulted or flung out of the capsule. They land somewhere damp and comfortable for them to grow into a gametophyte. They then,
if they're lucky.
Yes, if they're lucky. So they turn into a gametophyte, and the gametophyte then makes the sperm and egg cells, which then turn into the adult fern.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite complicated, but that's what they do.
Yeah, it's extremely complicated for a small plant. Okay, so now we know a little bit more about how ferns develop and their life cycle. Could you tell us a bit more about how you work with ferns?
Sure. A big part of my job is to learn how to better tell apart the different kinds of ferns that we have in New Zealand and to help other people learn how to tell the ferns apart. But also part of the job is to find new ferns. Now, it turns out that, well, probably not surprising, that the ferns that are easy to recognise are already well known, so it's the difficult ones that I tend to get left with.
Okay, and just before we move on to that, we've actually had a question from one of our viewers. Now, this question is, are any of our specimens of fern now extinct?
Oh, thinking through that in my head, I don't think there are any New Zealand ferns have gone extinct since people have arrived, so we're quite lucky in that regard. However, there are a number that are on the edge of extinction, or they're regarded as threatened by the Department of Conservation. So there's a few that need some work looking after.
Okay, thanks for that. And I guess that's potentially something we could expand further on our blog if people are interested.
Sure, absolutely.
So if you'd like to find out more about the ferns that are on the edge of extinction, email us in at sciencelive@tapapa.govt.nz, and Leon will be able to provide a blog with some more information.
That's right, yep.
Okay, so back to what you were saying before. You work on the ferns that are slightly more difficult to discover because all the easy ones have already been done. So do you think you could help us learn more about how to identify ferns?
Yeah, I think a good example to start with is to distinguish the two groups of tree ferns that we have in New Zealand, because tree ferns are pretty much everywhere. If you've got some forest near you, there's a good chance there's going to be a tree fern in there. And the two groups that we've got are scaly tree ferns and hairy tree ferns. There's about 5 species of scaly tree fern in mainland New Zealand and 3 species of hairy tree fern. So what I'm going to give you to look at are some structures that are occurring on the top of the tree fern trunk, kind of where the stalks of the fronds attach. And this has come from a tree fern grown into Papa's Bush City, but you can find it. It'll be on all tree ferns around.
Okay, so Leon's just going to get some slightly unusual structures out of a petri dish for us. Thank you very much. And I believe you're going to put some under the camera. That's right, isn't it? So you at home can take a bit of a closer look.
So the question here is, are these scales or hairs? And that's probably a pretty difficult question, actually, because you might be thinking, well, what are they in ferns? So the clue is a hair in a fern will look more or less like the hairs on a cat and a dog. So are what we're looking at, do they look like the hairs you'd find on a cat or a dog?
Okay, well, this is quite a tricky question to start off with, I have to say. These are quite broad and they're quite coarse. And I have to say, they don't really look like cat or dog hairs, but I think it will be easier for us and our viewers watching at home as well if we can see a comparison with the other type before we fully commit to a decision.
That's probably a wise decision, Ruth. Let's have a look at the second sample. So there's some for you and some going under the camera.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Leon. Now, hopefully you should be able to see those two types at home. And I'm holding the second type in my hand, and I can tell immediately that these are much thinner, they're much finer, and they're slightly matted as well, like when you don't brush a dog for a long time after it's been out for a walk. So I think the first kind, almost certainly scaly, and then the second kind, hairy. Is that correct?
That's quite right. So well done. But just to test what you've learned, let's have a look at a third sample and see what you reckon. So I'm just going to reach over here and grab this sample of it's a silver fern. We can see that it's white underneath, and even the stalk is white. Now these structures down here, I'll give some to Ruth, and I'll put some under the camera. And again, the question will be, is the silver fern a scaly tree fern or a hairy tree fern?
Okay, thanks, Leon. It's a beautiful specimen, actually. I'm not really a massive fan of making a fool out of myself live on camera, so I do hope this goes well. Having had a look at the structures, which hopefully you at home should be able to see under the camera as well, they're broader, again, more like the first example you showed me. Slightly fatter, definitely not coarse, not fine, sorry, and not like cat hair. So I'm going to go silver tree fern is a scaly fern.
Quite right. Yep, that's it.
Okay, so thanks for that. You've helped us identify more about one of New Zealand's national emblems, and you've helped us as well tell apart the two different types of tree ferns. That's correct, isn't it?
Yep. So the first step to identifying what a tree fern is, to work out what kind of species it is to establish, is it a hairy tree fern, or is it a scaly tree fern?
Okay, and anybody can use that knowledge if they go out walking in the bush on a weekend. They'll immediately be able to tell a little bit more about the tree ferns in their local habitat.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so now we know a little bit more about how to tell apart the two main groups of tree ferns. Could you tell us more about how you work with the difficult to identify species?
Yeah, well, a good place to, say, find new species is to go somewhere exotic. And I've been lucky enough to go to places like New Caledonia and Fiji, where there haven't been too many people looking at the plants there, and I found new species, new to science, or new to just those island groups. But you don't always have to go somewhere exotic to find something new or to work on something difficult. A few years ago, I was sitting in Te Papa's botany collection, which we'll look inside shortly. And I was sitting down at the bench working at a microscope like the one we've got over there. And I was looking at our collections of tangle ferns. Now, tangle ferns get their name because they have these fronds which kind of are all tangled with one another as they grow, but their taxonomy is also a bit of a tangle as well. So I was trying to teach myself how to tell apart the tangle ferns using the 200 specimens that we've got in Te Papa's collection. And I was going through and I came across something that looks like this, what I'm going to show you now.
Sure. Let's take a closer look at that image then.
So this is as if we were looking down a microscope. And you might actually even see the little yellow specks there. Those are actually the spores. Now, when I first saw this, I thought I was hallucinating. I pretty much fell off my chair. So let me try and explain that, because it might not look that impressive. What we've got there, just to the in the kind of the middle of the screen, or just to the left of the middle, there's actually a cluster of 3 spore capsules. Now, one of those spore capsules is actually empty, and you can kind of see inside it. The other, you can see there's a whole bunch of yellow spores there. Now, okay, so far so good. So what makes this interesting? Well, those spore capsules are actually sitting inside a pit or a hole that goes into the leaf of the fern. And we can kind of see that just to the right of the centre of the image, where there is a hole and the spore capsules have fallen away. And it's maybe a little bit hard to see because we're looking straight down, but there is a hole there. And what makes that so striking is that the spore capsules and the other tangle ferns actually sit flat on the undersurface of the fronds. So once I kind of collected my senses and started to believe my eyes again, I knew that I had a different species. It just looked so different. But we also did a bit of DNA work, the kind of work that you might see on a CSI type crime program, DNA analyses, and that sure enough showed that this was a new species of fern and only distantly related to the other tangle ferns that we've got in New Zealand.
So that's pretty exciting then. You managed to discover a whole new species just by looking at one part of its reproductive biology under a microscope. But I presume anybody can make similar discoveries using a magnifying glass or a microscope from a store?
Well, even something like a simple 10 times plastic magnifying glass like this is really useful for having a close look at nature. You'll see all sorts of wonderful and often beautiful things, and it literally opens up a whole new world.
Thank you. And so back to your exciting species of tanglefoot that you discovered. Did you get to name it, which for me, always the most exciting bit? Yeah, we did. I've actually got the box of the new species here, so let me get it out and show you. Because we've got the name on the front there. So the name of the new species of fern is Glycenia inclusisora. Now, Glycenia is just the scientific name for tangle fern. So the new part of the name, or the name for the new species, is inclusisora. It might sound a bit strange, but that is Latin for included or embedded reproductive structures. So it's named after that distinctive or the distinctive feature that I use to identify the fern as different. That sounds eminently sensible and extremely scientific. So do you get to name all the species you find?
If they're genuinely new, yeah, we do get to name them, and we try to give them sensible and meaningful names. So just some further examples, we named a fern a few years ago that's only found on Banks Peninsula, and we gave it the name Horamaka, which is a Māori name for Banks Peninsula. Another fern we described just last year was a little filmy fern that only occurs in wetter areas of the west coasts, and we called it Pluviatile, which is Latin for of the rain.
It's a surprisingly beautiful Latin word for something that's quite mundane, actually. So thank you very much for telling us about those discoveries. Now, here on Science Live, we like to take you behind the scenes, and Leon has extremely kindly given us an opportunity to do this. So earlier this week, Leon took our cameras on a tour of the botany lab, and he's going to talk through that tour right now.
Sure. So we're going to start off outside the botany collection, behind the scenes at Te Papa.
Okay, and there's the video now. So what's that red and white line there?
Well, it's a reminder about biosecurity.
Okay, and there you are, crossing that red and white line now.
Yeah. Well, it's a reminder that any plant material that's coming into the collection has to be frozen for 10 days before it can come in, and that's to kill any insects because we don't want to have them chewing their way through the collection. And secondly, once material is in the collection, it can only come out under special circumstances, and that's because biosecurity agencies are worried about some of the foreign plants that we have in the collection.
Okay, that seems perfectly sensible. And there you are, going through the corridor again and entering another room. So what's in there?
This is actually one of the storerooms. We've got two that hold the plant specimens. So we can see those blue shelves. They are actually rolling shelves, so that wheel there I'll use to move them along. And we can see lots and lots of boxes.
And if you watched our YouTube trailer earlier in the week, you might finally be able to find out what exactly was in that box.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fern, but let's see.
And so all of those boxes hold collection specimens, that's right?
Yeah, there'll be between probably 30 and 50 specimens in each of those boxes.
And what were those straps for?
Oh, those are earthquake straps, just to keep the boxes on the shelves in the event of an earthquake.
Okay, so there's Leon finally opening the box, and we're going to take a look inside.
Yeah, so what have we got? It's what we call a lance fern, scientific name Blechnum chimburzii. And this looks more or less like all of the specimens of the bigger plants that we have in the collection. So the plant specimen's been dried, pressed, mounted on cardboard, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there's a label that tells us what it is, who collected it, and where it's from.
Okay, so it contains useful information as well as the specimen itself.
Yeah, but we have more than just one specimen of each plant. Here we've got a second one, and this is a lot older. It's collected in 1888 by Augustus Hamilton, who went on to become a director of this museum.
Okay, and you can tell it's a lot older actually. It's certainly a lot browner, whereas the newer specimen was a lot greener. Now, 1888, that is pretty old. Is that the oldest specimen we have in the collection?
No, we can do better than that. We've got some older plants that date actually back to 1769, 1770. So specimens that were collected during Captain Cook's first expedition to New Zealand on board the Endeavour.
Okay, so that's 1769 and 1770.
Yeah, a long time ago. So opening up this box, what we've got inside is a specimen of the silver fern.
Okay, so that specimen of the silver fern travelled on Cook's voyage with him, is that correct?
Yep, it was on the Endeavour. It was probably in the same room as Captain Cook.
That's pretty exciting. So there we can see a stamp saying Banks and Solander. Now, are they the botanists, the people who collected that fern?
Yep, that's right. Yeah, they were the scientists on board Captain Cook's first voyage. So that red writing there, that's actually Daniel Solander's handwriting. He's written Polypodium excelsum, and that's the name he gave to that fern. Turns out, though, that Banks and Solander never got around to publishing all their work. And because of that, we don't use Solander's name. So today, the silver fern, the scientific name we use is Cyathea dealbata.
So poor Solander went halfway around the world to collect these ferns, these extremely important ferns that ended up in our collection, and never got to name it.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Yep, but we still recognise the importance of these specimens, for they're culturally very significant to think that those are actually on the Endeavour. But also they're scientifically valuable because they show beyond doubt what species, and we've got about 330 species represented amongst that Banks and Solander collection, shows beyond doubt that those species were present in New Zealand before Europeans arrived.
Okay, and there you are, tidying up after yourself like every good scientist should and putting those specimens away. So before we get into talking a little bit more about the collection, we've actually had a question in from our audience. And the question is, what's the best environment for ferns to grow in? And I'm not sure if that means in your garden or whether that's in the wild, so perhaps you could answer both of those.
Yeah, well, ferns generally like it quite wet, although there are actually some that will grow in the desert, interestingly enough. In terms of kind of where do you get the most ferns in the world, it's in the tropics. So this might be a surprising fact, is that Fiji, which is a much smaller land area than New Zealand, has over 330 different species of fern, whereas New Zealand has only got 200 different species of fern.
Okay, so generally tropical and slightly damp. Does it matter about the temperature at all?
Well, some ferns like it warmer, some like it colder, but there seems to be more different kinds of ferns in the warmer areas.
Okay, and so thanks very much for answering that. We'll get back to the collections now. So what are you using the collections for at the moment?
Well, the big project that we're working on now is what we call the E-flora, and it's an online account of New Zealand's plants. Now, it's actually an update of this. Now, this might look a bit like a Bible, and it's almost as old, but this is a definitive account of New Zealand's ferns and most of the flowering plants. And it dates from 1961. It's full of words, lots of text, and there's a few black and white line drawings, no photos. But what we're doing is trying to update this. And what's going to happen is online there's going to be an account of all the plants that we've got in New Zealand. So it's going to tell you what we've got, what it looks like, how to tell them apart, and where they occur. We're doing this work in conjunction with land care research. One of the components that we're doing here at Te Papa is the ferns.
Okay, and anyone will be able to access information if it's online?
Yeah, it's really available. You'll be able, if you're connected to the internet, you'll be able to get hold of it.
Okay, and so I understand why it's great for the public to have access to this, but why are you doing it?
Well, it's really about basic management of our biodiversity. If we want to get anywhere close to managing our plants and animals and other organisms, anywhere close to sustainably, we've got to know what's in the country, got to know whether it's native, whether it's introduced, is it rare, is it common.
Okay, and so for those of you who might want to find out more, we'll put a link to that on our blog on Monday. And I believe we've got another question in as well. And the question, Leon, if you're happy to answer this, is how many of our 280,000 plant specimens are endemic to New Zealand? This one could be a bit tricky.
I can kind of answer that. So we've got 280,000 plant specimens in the collection. And they, if you like, are representing the different kinds of plant species that we have in New Zealand and around the world. So in terms of the ferns, we've got 200 species of ferns that are native to New Zealand, and about 100 of them, roughly, are endemic, meaning only found in New Zealand. That means another 100 occur in New Zealand and somewhere else. In terms of the seed plants, just to give you another example, there's about 2,500 different kinds of seed plants, the things that flowers, for instance, that occur in New Zealand. For them, about 80%, so a higher proportion or higher percentage, are only found in New Zealand, are endemic.
Thanks, Leon, and thanks for having those figures just at the top of your head as well. It's extremely impressive. So to go back to your collection and how other people can access it, I believe you're also working on a citizen science project at the moment. Is that right?
That's right. We're really encourage everyone to get involved in understanding the plants and animals and fungi and everything else that grows around us. And so we're really keen on citizen science, people getting out there and looking at what occurs around them. So we're actually running a competition in conjunction with the Science Live event. So what we're asking people to do is grab the cameras, get outside, or maybe inside if you've got a fern inside, find some ferns, perhaps in the reserve down the road or maybe in your own garden. And what you can do, there's two ways to enter, and there's actually a prize. So you can either enter, when you do enter, you can either win one of the books from Te Papa Press, or maybe even get a personal tour of the botany collection here at Te Papa. So the ways to enter. So either email your photo to the Science Live email address, which is sciencelive@tepapa.govt.nz, or even better, best way to enter the competition is to upload your photos to the citizen science website, Nature Watch, because once you do that, your observations will go towards being data for future scientific research.
Okay, and for those of you at home, I happen to know that Leon has an extremely shiny camera that he uses to take photos of ferns, but you don't need that. You can use something like your phone or a tablet device or any kind of camera really. And also Nature Watch have an app, so you can also utilise that to go online and check out our Find Ferns and Win competition. But to reiterate what Leon said, citizen science is for anybody. It's any age, any school group. We want all of you to take part. So you can go on to Te Papa's blog, which is blog.tepapa.govt.nz, find out the rules of the competition, find out how to enter, and more importantly, find out what you can win.
Yeah, that's right. And don't worry if you don't know the names of the ferns you're seeing. That's our job to tell you.
That's true. So we have the experts, and all we need is your pictures, and then hopefully you'll be in with a chance of winning some great prizes. Now, I'm afraid to say, Leon, that's all we've got time for on this week's Science Live. So thanks very much for sharing your fern expertise with us, and also showing us behind the scenes at the botany collection.
That's great. Welcome.
Thanks very much. So to wrap things up, thank you, Leon, for taking part. And that's all we've got time for Science Live. But science is always happening at Te Papa, and you can ask our scientists questions on Twitter using the hashtag ScienceLiveTePapa, on our blog, which is blog.tepapa.govt.nz, or by emailing sciencelive@tepapa.govt.nz. And we're really looking forward to seeing your Find Ferns and Win competition entries. So that's all we've got time for now, and hopefully we'll see you later in the year for another Science Live. Take care.